I am very happy to be speaking about China and Africa. It is a subject that interests me a great deal based on personal experience. When I was deputy chief of mission at the US Embassy in Sudan from 2008 to 2010, I saw firsthand how the Chinese, or the People's Republic of China, the PRC, as I will call it, worked to increase their influence with really a savage dictatorship, the al-Bashir dictatorship. And then, as Sandy said, when I went on to Equatorial Guinea as ambassador from 2012 to 2015, there the brutal Obiang regime also was courted by the Chinese. Now, it is no coincidence that both these countries and other countries where the Chinese are in large numbers, including Nigeria and Angola, have large oil and gas resources. This is important to the Chinese because they import a great deal of oil and gas from all of these countries. But that's not the only reason that African countries are important to China. There are political reasons as well, which I will discuss briefly during my presentation. For the first 20 minutes or so, I'm going to expand a little bit on the chapter or the article that we have all read about China's growing influence in Africa. And I will also give you some of my personal thoughts based on the experience I had serving in Africa. I think great decisions should be a dialogue. I know when I did this in person, there were a lot of backs and forths. I really enjoy that. I'm sure we have some Africa hands on this call. So if you have a question or you wish me to clarify something during my introduction, as Sandy said, you can put it in the comment box or go ahead, come on, and we can talk just as we would in an audience, and I will do my very best to respond. After my remarks, I'd like to get your thoughts on this article. There are some questions at the end, and we can discuss those. Other questions I'm sure will come up, and we can also go over them. So, as Sandy said, without further ado, let's get started. Cobus van Staden, the gentleman who wrote the article, I think does a good job of providing a historical summary in his opening. But I found a few gaps, and I would like to fill those in terms of how I personally view China in Africa. We go back to the initial interest, which is in 1949, Mao Zedong and the communists have won in China. And I think as you look at China's influence in Africa during this first period, you need to view it very much within a Cold War context. China's Communist Party very much wanted to spread Maoist revolutionary ideology throughout the world. And as they looked at Africa, the conditions there, particularly the political ones, seemed very opportune. From the 1950s to the mid-1970s, as the article says, China supported national liberation movements, fighting for independence of African countries against European colonialism. And China also condemned what it called the running dogs of capitalism. Yep. Just love that phrase. The PRC argued it was uniquely suited to help African countries to gain leverage over what it said was a politically and economically exploitative West. Well, after the PRC split with the Soviet Union in the late 1950s, it doubled down even harder on this assertion. China entered into a competition with its former Soviet ally to exercise dominance over what we used to call third world countries. Now, the Chinese claimed that Russian communism had become corrupt, bourgeois, and in no way was appropriate for what was going on in Africa. And in contrast, they made the argument that their revolutionary Maoist ideology was more in keeping with the struggle that was being waged at that time by Africa's liberation fighters. During this first period, economically, communist China was building into an economic power. So they were only able to provide limited foreign assistance to Africa. But they made up for that by shipping small arms, most of them Chinese constructed AK-47s, to liberation fighters. And they also sent trainers, political people who talked about ideology, about guerrilla tactics. So that was very much prominent during that first time. And it was probably capped off by the visit of Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai in late 1963, early 1964, to 10 countries in Africa. And he was there to build the bilateral ties. Now, those countries included Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, most of which had gained their independence, the African countries, recently. Well, by the mid to late 1960s, most African countries had gained their independence. And once they did, China, which had helped them during this process, had a request. And the Chinese more or less said, we need you to do us a favor, very much as our disgraced former president would say several decades later. Red China, as some people called it back then, wanted African nations to break diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, or Taiwan, and to recognize the PRC instead as the true China. Well, during the post-World War II period, Taiwan still held the China seat on the UN National Security Council. And the PRC very badly wanted that seat for a couple of reasons. First of all, doing so would give the Chinese communists the international recognition that they craved and that they argued because they said they were the one legitimate Chinese nation. But also having a seat on the UN Security Council, the Permanent Five, as it's called, would provide them a great deal of influence. They would have a veto power. So this was tremendously important to China. Well, I think as most of the people know on this call, the PRC finally achieved that goal in October of 1971. With the support of a significant number of African countries, and most importantly, after the US recognized the PRC during the Nixon administration, the PRC replaced Taiwan on the UN Security Council. This was a major change. It gave China a certain amount of international legitimacy, and it allowed it to enter into relationships with the US and other Western countries to begin what was its path to becoming an economic superpower. And this brings me to the second part of China's involvement in Africa, which I would say was largely a pragmatic one that began in the 1990s. China, at this point, having grown economically, saw Africa as a growing market for its products. And most significantly, as a ready source for natural resources, particularly petroleum and gas, which were needed to fuel its growing, expanding industries. At the same time, there were more or less 54 independent nations now in Africa, and all of them in the UN General Assembly could help China, could support it, voting as a bloc. At the same time, China was on the UN Security Council, and it had a veto power, and it could support Chinese countries in what they wanted. So what we saw during this second period was quite a bit of a political alliance between the Chinese and the Africans. Now, the other thing that the article discusses, and is quite true, is that when China went into African countries, the first thing it talked about was its policy of non-interference. And this was particularly useful in authoritarian countries, which abused human rights and had no aspiration for democracy, because the Chinese would stand back. And the Chinese saying back then, or actually part of their policy, was that, quote, encroachment and interference from any quarter should be opposed. Well, having said that, we also know that US and Western countries during the post-war period would easily put aside respect for human rights, democracy, and economic reform when they were dealing with authoritarian countries, whenever it suited our African foreign policy priorities. As long as these countries persist anti-communism, the US supported dictatorial regimes in places like Nigeria, Sudan, Congo, Zaire, Somalia, and yes, my favorite country, Equatorial Guinea. But depending on the administration, I think it's also fair to say that the US, especially during recent years, has made assistance and various sorts of support conditional on support by repressive regimes to improvement in the treatment of their citizens. This was particularly true in Sudan, where I served. Back in the 1990s, the US put economic sanctions on the repressive al-Bashir government. And they did so first because in the 1990s, that government supported Osama bin Laden, who lived in Sudan for a period. And then following that, what happened in Darfur, which Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at the time, called a genocide. US put more sanctions on Sudan. In contrast, China didn't say anything. China was very much interested in the country's vast oil and gas resources. And it also said nothing about atrocities committed by the al-Bashir government in South Sudan during the war that was going on until 2005. Now, what happened in Sudan is that Chevron, actually one of the US oil majors, had discovered oil in Sudan in the 1980s. But because of the sanctions, neither Chevron nor any other of the US oil majors could operate. And the same was true of other US companies in Sudan. They couldn't ship things in, very limited what they should do. And this opened up the door for China, for India, for Russia, and Malaysia, particularly in the oil and gas industry, where all of them played a major role. Now, whether or not you like US oil companies and I just bet you that a lot of the people on this call do not. Um, I would argue that they, unlike the Chinese, provide millions of dollars in what is called corporate social responsibility programs, CSR. And those programs in Sudan and in Equatorial Guinea were in education, health, and sanitation. And all of them were directed at basic needs of citizens. At the same time, what I saw in both, well, particularly in Equatorial Guinea, is that the US companies provided training programs, sometimes in the United States, and they hired a great number of Africans, and they also put them in mid-level management positions. Um, what we saw with China was very different. The Chinese, in general, brought in their own laborers, their own managers. They often lived apart, particularly the laborers, in separate camps. And the few Africans that they hired were mistreated, frequently unpaid, but were the object of incredible racial discrimination. And here I will tell you a firsthand story. I had a good collegial relationship with the Chinese ambassador in Equatorial Guinea. And one day we were in a meeting and I said, Mr. Ambassador, why is it that Chinese companies don't hire more Africans? Why are they not being trained for managerial positions? And the Chinese ambassador kind of looked at me, put his head back, rolled his eyes, kind of chuckled. And he said, Mr. Ambassador, you know that old saying about the Chinese. We Chinese work harder than anybody. And when it comes to these Africans, they're lazy, they're undependable. Well, I have to say, I was surprised hearing this come from a well-educated ambassador. But that example of Chinese attitudes towards Africans, I found personally to be very common. Now, there's a reason for this. A great number of the Chinese laborers who are recruited to go to Africa come out of rural areas in China. They are not well educated when they arrive in Africa, unlike the diplomats and some of the technical people who speak local languages, or at least national language. They don't speak those languages. And they often are people who have had little contact with other cultures, other peoples, certainly not Black Africans. And so this leads to a certain degree of xenophobia. In Sudan, I would often run into Chinese workers at bazaars, and they were accompanied by an English language interpreter because English was frequent in Sudan when you went to these markets. Well, the workers sometimes would start screaming in Chinese at the African merchants. They were often haggling over ivory. And when they thought the price was too high, they became really angry. They would shake their fists, they would make hostile gestures. It was very clear what they thought about the Africans. And then their Chinese interpreter would do the interpretation into English. And it was very clear the degree of disrespect that the Chinese felt for the Sudanese. And I have to say, given my time in Africa, I found the Sudanese to be among the most gracious and friendly people. And so it was particularly jarring to see how they were treated. This isn't just true in the few countries where I served. In the East African nation of Zambia, there are presently about 22,000 Chinese nationals, and they're operating some 280 companies, mostly in mining and in textile. And Last spring, the mayor of Lusaka, which is Zambia's capital, accused the Chinese bosses in the factories, in the mines, of treating the Chinese workers like slaves, of abusing them, not paying them. And last spring, racial tensions ran high in Zambia. And several days after the mayor's comments, there was a confrontation at a Chinese owned textile factory. Disgruntled Zambians arrived. They entered into an argument with the owner's wife. The owner was in China. And this led to them murdering the owner's wife and two Chinese employees who tried to defend her. And the factory was burnt down to the ground. Now, admittedly, this is an extreme example of anti-Chinese sentiment, but I would say that the flooding of Africa with cheap Chinese goods sold by Chinese small merchants has created certainly less violent, but clear resentment among Africans. African shopkeepers and small industries in Africa simply can't compete with the Chinese in terms of this flooding of their markets. And you can add to this recent stories which we have all read during the pandemic about the treatment of Chinese by Chinese of Africans in cities like Guangzhou, where the Africans literally have been barricaded in their apartments. All of this can lead to explosive situations and hostility. Well, having said all of this, as we all know, and as the article says, African leaders have been more than happy to welcome Chinese investment. And this is particularly true of huge loans for massive infrastructure projects. When I was in Equatorial Guinea, the Chinese had just floated $1 billion loan. And the president looked at me one day and said, well, you guys aren't offering us that amount of money. And, we don't have to repay it for a long time. So why not take it? Chinese state companies came in there and in other places throughout Africa to build roads, bridges, dams, railroads, and ports. Now, many argue that without Chinese financing, these development projects would be impossible. And so they give credit to the Chinese. Others see it as exploitation, as a means for the Chinese to gain influence within the countries. But since COVID, the Chinese are also using a different form of diplomacy, which I find fascinating and which the article does not discuss. We can call it vaccine diplomacy. Last week in Equatorial Guinea, it became the first country on the continent to receive a donation of 100,000 doses of Chinese Sinopharm anti-COVID vaccine. The son of the president, who sadly is the next dictator in waiting in Equatorial Guinea, told the media only the Chinese extended their hand to us, for which we will be forever grateful. And then the Chinese Foreign Ministry put out a press release and said, Equatorial Guinea is just the first country that we're giving this sort of assistance. And this is all in fulfillment of what President Xi said at the 2020 China-Africa Summit on Solidarity Against COVID, that China would provide vaccines to all of Africa. Well, that sounds real good, but Equatorial Guinea is a country of about 1 million people. 100,000 doses, if you divide them up into 2 shots, covers just 50,000 people. And that is about 4% of Equatorial Guinea's population. And I can assure you that the 4% will come from the first family, who have all now been vaccinated. The director general of the one party ruling state has also been vaccinated. And this has led the opposition, which is small and beleaguered in Equatorial Guinea, to say, hey, what about the rest of us? And the government has not had a good answer to that. And despite the massive oil revenues that Equatorial Guinea gets, Equatorial Guinea has not offered to start buying vaccine for everybody else. Now, my point on this is that the Chinese make these gestures as a way to show solidarity with Africans, just as they did during the first period. And the West and the US are seen, fairly or not, as doing little or nothing to help Africa during this terrible time. Let's talk a little bit about the US. As you recall, during the Trump administration, following the America First policy, Trump refused to participate in or provide any funding for the international COVAX initiative. What is COVAX? COVAX is a global collaboration supported by our European allies and most developed countries to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to COVID tests, treatments, and vaccines. And the last administration said, yeah, sorry, not interested. Now, last Saturday, President Biden did a virtual address to the Munich Security Council or conference. And during that address, he changed US policy. He said that we would support COVAX, and he said we would allocate $4 billion to COVAX. At the same time, you've probably read in the press that the US is providing support to Guinea, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania as it fights a resurgence of Ebola virus in those countries. And I have to say, I think these are important steps. Let me begin to conclude with yet a final aside. Back in 2014, during the Ebola outbreak, I was ambassador in Equatorial Guinea. You know, and back then it was the US and not China, which was getting praise from African leaders from what we were doing, particularly the role of the CDC, which was most prominent in Liberia. One day I was in a meeting with the president of Equatorial Guinea, and Ebola had not come to Equatorial Guinea. Unfortunately, it never did. But the president said, what if it does? What can we expect from the US? Will you come to help us? And I was able to say to him, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. President, as soon as there are verified Ebola cases here, the CDC will be on the ground to help you. And I was able to say that because I had been in contact with the then CDC director, Tom Frieden, and Dr. Frieden had given me his personal commitment that this would happen. And that gave the US quite a bit of influence during the Ebola outbreak. Well, you know, sadly, those days are gone, and particularly with former President Trump's dismissive reference to what he called African shithole countries, excuse my language, US prestige and diplomacy in Africa have fallen to new lows. And I'm happy to discuss that a bit. As you know, the article talks about what the US might do in Africa to improve its standing. But I think this is a nice segue for us to discuss the article, for me to take your questions. I'm very curious what your reaction was to the author's statements. how do you view China's present role in Africa? Is it something positive, as a lot of people have argued, and I think that the author does to a degree, or some others, taking a very hard line, have said that it is the beginning of neocolonialism by the Chinese in Africa. There are lots of questions out there, and I am more than happy to begin our discussion with your comments on my talk or on the article itself. So, Sandy, over to you. What are people interested in?
Thank you, Mark. Wonderful. So let me just tell folks to raise your hand, and I will unmute you, and you can show your video, of course, if you like. I'm going to just get the ball rolling by offering a little observation and a question, but we'd love to have you all participate. So probably best to just hold on your video just for a second, and then we'll come to you. So again, just raise your hand, and then we can kind of do it all in the proper order. So the thing I have to reflect on was, I was living in Zambia in 2005, 2006. There was this incredible amount of construction going on right in the diplomatic area of Lusaka, with these walls that were so high you couldn't possibly get over, and all these rumors of what China was up to in building behind these walls. And then I was able to actually ride the Tazara Railway, which they mentioned here, which was a great source of pride. But one thing that was really interesting among my Zambian colleagues, and especially my good friend Joe Kasande, who eventually became the Minister of Health and had been very much involved in Zambian politics for decades, was how Zambia was part of the non-aligned movement. And as part of the non-aligned movement, they were very much involved with China over decades, so that the resurgence of Chinese investment and presence and so on in Africa in the 2000s was, for a lot of African countries, really just a kind of continuation of what had been happening, especially with students from Zambia going to China for various different parts of instruction. So my question for you, Mark, is China has long declared that it doesn't want to interfere in internal politics of various African countries, and yet the amount of money that they pump in via private sector investment or loans or outright doing infrastructure is very much meddling in domestic internal politics. So is China basically just convincing itself that it doesn't want to do this, but accepts that it is doing it? I mean, how do we make sense of their policy of non-interference when they're really doing everything they can to influence, an economy, or even in by default, domestic politics?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It is non-interference, but when it suits Chinese interests, and I think particularly in countries that have democratic governments, they like the fact that the Chinese are not attaching strings to loans. There was a big IMF loan to Equatorial Guinea, but it was based on fighting corruption, on joining the transparency movement in terms of its revenues. And Chinese say, fine, we don't care whether you do any of that. But at the same time, the Chinese have a great deal of influence. When Equatorial Guinea about a year ago had a temporary seat on the Security Council, it voted lockstep with every single thing that the Chinese wanted. It was really striking. And this was a country that previously, when I would go to demarche them on some position, would say, no, we're just going to vote the same way that the African Union does. No, we're part of a larger entity. But the Chinese had incredible influence on them in the UN. The other thing that I would say, getting back to the high walls that you saw in Zambia or Lusaka, I saw some of those same walls in Equatorial Guinea and in Sudan. And the sad thing is that these countries where this happens provide women regularly often trafficked to the workers. And it becomes scandalous. And it's wide open in terms of, women being provided to the workers. And so any efforts that the US or other countries make on anti-trafficking falls on deaf ears, as do trafficking in workers from the host countries or sometimes elsewhere, who wind up working for the Chinese for very low wages. Most of the countries in Africa talk about local content when an investor comes in. In Equatorial Guinea, you're supposed to have 80, 90% local content in terms of hiring people from the countries, as well as sourcing your materials. Host governments just ignore that with the Chinese. I mean, they certainly do it with American firms, and even with the U.S. Embassy. We were really quite compliant in terms of our employment. I think we were up to 90%. So yeah, there's a double standard, Sandy, that I see, of accusing Western companies or countries of using their power for influence, which they do, of course, but at the same time, the Chinese really drive some very hard bargains.
Yeah. Let's turn to our audience. And in fact, I'm not going to call you the audience anymore. I'm going to call you, I'm going to call you part of the discussion now. And Teresa Ortiz, I see you have your hand raised and you're unmuted. If you want to put your screen on, that's great. If not, please just go ahead and ask your question.
I'm not able to turn on my video. I think you have control of that.
I will ask you to start your video.
Okay.
Aha.
Thanks.
Hi, Teresa. Nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you. Nice to meet you, Mr. Asquino. I did have some questions about the Tazara Railway. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. But in regard to bringing in Chinese labor versus African labor, can you please expound as to the construction of the railway across the country of Africa in trying to establish inter-country, I guess it would be infrastructure, so that goods and services could be transported more economically. Can you please talk very specifically about how the railroad developed over time? What was the Chinese involvement, not only from the financial side, but also from the human capital side, and then some of the trafficking pieces that you were discussing in regard to the Zambian high walls and construction and that piece, if you don't mind.
I can speak in general on what the Chinese are doing, and I would agree with the article in the sense that there is great value in these projects which try to link African countries. When South Sudan became independent, for example, it had no way except through the north. Most of the oil is in the south. To get its oil to market. And so there was discussion at that point of building a rail link which would go to the Kenyan port of Mombasa. Now, it's very hard to get Western investors to do this because it's a very volatile region, particularly in South Sudan since independence. But I was struck in reading the article that the Chinese have talked about building such a link, which would really help the South Sudanese. And I think it's true of the other projects, including the railway. The sense I got from the article was that a lot of these projects don't get finished, that corruption is involved, that the budgets balloon. The other thing that I saw when I was in Africa is that the quality of the work by the Chinese often is not good. Roads wind up washing out. The safety standards that the Chinese have are far less than Western standards. People get hurt. So those are all things that one sees. But the whole effort by the Chinese, the Road and Belt Initiative, which the article talks about, is important for Africa, but is also important for China. China is not doing this out of the goodness of its heart. It is doing so, as I think the author was quite right in saying, to make the world more China-centric, based on the old Silk Road, where all roads led to China from Europe. So I don't know, Sandy, whether you have anything more specific on that railway project. I don't know much more about it beyond what I read in the article. Did you, get a sense of how well the Chinese were doing with the project?
I don't have a great sense of that whatsoever.
Yeah.
My experience was simply experiencing something that the Chinese had built that was a real source of pride. Because obviously for Zambia being so intensely landlocked, it was really a window and a connection to the world beyond. And for me, it was really the sense, we have all been raised in a particular culture that places China, over here. And in Zambia, that was very much not the case, that China was seen as a friend, as an entity that in many ways was parallel to, Western efforts over the centuries in various different African countries. And that was really interesting. It was really eye-opening for me. And I think it's just extended more and more into the present where, technology and Chinese technology and the role of Huawei and other companies in Africa has been really widely and openly embraced. Whereas here, we have a very different, perspective on these things. I think that the last thing I'll just say was just this incredibly different cultural perspective of what the Chinese were up to. We can view it in our own way. And I certainly, reading this article, there is a very certain, I don't want to say bias, but a certain perspective of what China's doing, which I can't fault. But certainly from an African perspective, it's a very different understanding of what China might be up to, or the very different kinds of doors that China can open for Africans. So it's super interesting.
Let me just say a few words on your question about trafficking, Teresa. U.S. government through the State Department has 3 levels called tiers when it comes to looking at what countries are doing to combat trafficking, both for sexual and labor purposes. And if you are on tier 3, which is the lowest tier, you have sanctions. It makes it harder for you to get assistance from the U.S. because you were judged not to be doing anything significant to stop human trafficking in your country. Then there is level 2, where you were doing some things that we regard as beneficial, and that will take you off the sanctions list. And then there's tier 1. We rate ourselves as well. There is serious trafficking in this country, and although we are normally tier 1, there's a lot of criticism. Our government could be doing a lot more. And when I would discuss this with countries where I served, I would always say, if you follow the press, we've got problems too. We're not putting ourselves up as an example. There are a lot of countries doing better than the U.S. is on trafficking. But when countries don't do anything, and that was the case in Equatorial Guinea for most of the time I was there, you really see these horrible situations where often the people who are trafficked and the victims are, blamed, are arrested, sent back to their countries. Equatorial Guinea has gotten better. They are now on what is called Tier 2 watch list, which means we think they're better, but we're watching them, but we're taking off sanctions. But it's an enormous problem throughout the world, and not just in developing or African countries.
Part of my thoughts and concerns also involve, because of mass migrations due to genocides and other things that are happening in surrounding countries,
Right.
have these huge refugee camps
Yep.
that seem a ripe location
Yep.
for these traffickers to come in and gather up workers, gather
Yep.
up for sex trade, gather up for,
Yep.
and so my concern is how then, when you're in a tiered system such as this, when maybe the people are powerless, maybe the governments are not powerless, but the people themselves are powerless to lift themselves out of the situation where they are being picked like fruit, if you will. How can the West offer the greatest amount of assistance to reduce that trafficking piece? It seems like such a huge challenge and a huge problem.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. In Darfur, where I spent a fair amount of time, U.S. and international NGOs were doing heroic work in providing the basic necessities to people, but also often training them so that they had skills that they could market on the larger economy. It was very dangerous for those NGOs in Darfur. And I used to go and talk to them about security. The UN was there. There's a UN peacekeeping mission. But I always walked away from those meetings saying, I'm a diplomat. I'm going to get in an armored car. I have somebody with an assault rifle sitting in the front seat. Now, maybe that was not absolute protection. It was not. But I was a heck of a lot more protected than they were going out to the bush. I worry about what is happening in South Sudan right now with the enormous influx of Ethiopians from Tigray, from that northern region, who are coming into a country that is struggling economically and rebuilding from war, and what those people are going to do. And I don't see the amount of international assistance that's needed. So I share your concern. When you see people in those conditions, particularly children, it's just heartbreaking. It is absolutely heartbreaking. And you try as a diplomat to do everything that you can, but it is often the private sector that does the most. And I have enormous admiration for them for the danger they put themselves in.
Question here. Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. And thank you, Teresa, for your question. Question from Scott Button. Good morning, Scott. Go ahead.
Good morning, Tandy. How are you?
Good.
Good morning. Good morning, Mark.
Hey, Scott. Always nice to see you. Good morning.
Thank you. This may properly be a topic for a dissertation rather than a question in response to your presentation and the paper. But let me pose it this way. We've watched what China has been doing for quite a while now in Africa. We have a pretty good sense of it. It's geopolitics being played and played rather effectively by Beijing. What is the appropriate and effective counter to that by the United States?
Yeah.
How do we assert our influence there in a proper and affordable, a democratic fashion? Because in the absence of some plan to do that and doing it effectively, we cede the ground to the Chinese, and they continue to do what they do with the impact that you've pointed out, that the article points out, et cetera. If you can wrap your head around that question, with my apologies for putting you
not
in
at
that
all.
position, would be fascinated in your perspective.
Scott, it's a wonderful question, one I think about all the time. During the Obama administration, I really think we were on the right road to doing what needed to be done. And the first thing that I recall, and I attended in 2014, was the Africa Leaders Conference that took place in Washington with virtually all of the African leaders, with the exception of the leaders from Eritrea and at the time Zimbabwe, because Mugabe was in power. But Obiang was invited, much to his surprise. And it got all of the African leaders together. They met with the president over several days. They discussed things that the US could do to help them. But connected with that was an African US entrepreneurs conference that took place in New York. And the focus was on partnership. You know, the Obama administration always said trade, not aid. And they had a couple of initiatives in Africa. One was called Power Africa, where they were looking at ways to work with Africans on wind, solar, whatever would work in those countries to help them become energy independent. They were also working on Feed Africa, not shipping in tons of goods, but working with people on how to increase agricultural yield. Those were wonderful initiatives. The other initiative that started in the Obama administration was called YALI, the Young African Leader Initiative, and it later became the Yali Mandela Fellowships, where they brought young entrepreneurs, people from all different sectors, to the United States. They always met with the president, and they had a chance to make connections here. It was continued under Trump, but rather than meeting with the president, when the Yali people came in the last 4 years, they got to meet with Ivanka, which I always wondered about. But the other thing that we have fallen so far short on is fellowships, is exchanges. The Chinese have expanded. I haven't talked about soft power. It's part of the article. The Confucius Institutes have been very successful in ways that the U.S. Information Agency, for which I've worked for over 20 years, used to do through our centers, training people in English. Africans are really attracted to the U.S. We had a hip hop group come when I was in Equatorial Guinea. Africans loved it, and they were a wonderful group who met with so many young people. Chinese can't compete with us in that way, and they can't compete with us, as the article says, in terms of the quality of our education. We have to do a great deal more. Africa has a thriving young population. They're smart. Despite what the Chinese ambassador said, they are hardworking. They are innovative, and we need to show up. And one of the good things during the Biden campaign that I heard, I worked on the Africa policy side as a volunteer, is that Biden is going to have another all-Africa conference. He promised during the first year. Those are just some of the things. We have fallen so far behind. The role of the CDC was so prominent and now has fallen so far behind. So thank you for the question. It's one I'm very passionate about.
Well, thank you for the answer.
Let me chime in, Mark, with a quick follow-up from Chuck Boxwell, who's asking about these educational issues. Given what the disastrous policies of the Trump administration in rejecting, denying visas and so on of foreign students, including, of course, Africans.
Yep.
What's the U.S. doing now to not only counter Chinese investment in African education and African students, but what will or should or can the U.S. do to kind of correct or change this flow of education back towards, a really friendly relationship with the United States?
Yeah, it's another excellent question. One of the very first things that the Biden administration did on the first day was get rid of the Muslim ban. And the Muslim ban had affected Sudan, it had affected Chad, it had affected Somalia. But as he raises it just wasn't the Muslim ban. There was an intentional slowdown in the issuance of visas throughout Africa, and it tremendously hurt U.S. Educational institutions. I think there are a couple of things. I think we can do much more as a government, increasing fellowships like Fulbright, Muskie, Humphrey. When I was in Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall, we had something called the Future Leaders Exchange, FLEX, which sent young people to US high schools for a year living with host families. Unlike the Chinese, everything is controlled by the state. So a lot of what needs to be done is through the private sector, but we really have to do more. We have fallen so hard behind. And, I have seen the enthusiasm when we have been able to send people to the United States.
Jesus, come on, Mark.
I am afraid that, some of the things that have happened in our country, George Floyd, has frightened people of color. And we have to address that. And we have to address what happened in our country on January 6th. And that has to be done through soft power, through talking about what our values are. And that is an enormous challenge for our new Secretary of State. And I wish they would start talking more about soft power and all of these studies that they've done about rebuilding state. But that's another topic.
That's for another day. Yes. So Judith Alger, you've got your hand up. Hi, Judith. Come on.
Hello.
Bring your question.
Okay.
Hi, Judith.
Mark, the obvious question to ask you is, why haven't you talked about the Peace Corps? Both your wife and I are Peace Corps volunteers. That's perfect soft power.
Judith, you are so right. And of course, the Trump administration pulled everybody out. Yeah. And the question is, what is going to happen? Because we need the Peace Corps. I have served in countries where the Peace Corps can do so much. And so you're right, it is a major part of soft power. Peace Corps has prestige. It is not politicized in the way that a lot of other things are across the world and in Africa. So yes, I thank you for reminding me. My wife, for her, she would have reminded me.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
I appreciate the question, and you're absolutely right. We need to do more at the Peace Corps.
I'll check out.
So, yeah, and honestly, hopefully, with the pandemic and how that affected Peace Corps, Trump administration policies that affected Peace Corps, hopefully we'll see a resumption of that particular piece of soft diplomacy coming up.
I really do hope so.
Couple questions here. Well, one in the chat, and also Gina, you have your hand raised, and please unmute yourself and show yourself if you like, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. This has been excellent.
Hi, Gina.
Hi, Mark. I'll just read my question.
Okay.
In my 6 years, or my 6 trips to sub-Saharan Africa, I have noted Chinese presence everywhere, even on the spice farms in hot Zanzibar. But what is most alarming is the change by the relatively new president in Botswana.
Mm-hmm.
Having enjoyed a relatively successful march to democracy and economic success since 1895, Botswana's stewardship of wildlife proved to be quite profitable. But the new president surprisingly abandoned much of the effort on behalf of that profitability using their wildlife. Did the Chinese play a role in that change of heart?
You know, supposedly the Chinese now have laws restricting the import of ivory, of other goods that are derived from wildlife, but I certainly didn't see that. I really saw the Chinese as driving that trade. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that Africa has thrived on, and of course the pandemic has affected it, is ecotourism, safaris, all of those things, natural conservation. It is something that the Chinese have no respect for. They have no respect for environmental protection. And so I think that often, yeah, leaders come to power and say, well, you know, we don't really need to do this. Our friends the Chinese are helping us. And I think it is very disruptive and something that is very sad. I mean, it's not only the Chinese, you know, people, big game hunters have come in, including members of the president's former family, our president's family, you know, to kill beautiful animals. And President Trump talked about them bringing in their trophies. We have a role in this regard. We can provide help. Africans could teach us a lot, actually, in terms of natural parks, but it is enormously important. And the other thing, you know, you go to these markets, which have wild game meat of all sorts, and destroying protected animals and animals that need to be protected. Again, I think we can do a lot more, and I think it has been a negative aspect of Chinese influence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't see any other questions, but of course, folks, if you have one, now is the time. Let me ask you one question, Mark. I know,
sure,
as you mentioned earlier, you've been working to help put some good ideas and so on into the ear of the Biden administration. Tell us, what's your one big idea, aside from soft diplomacy? And I know we could talk about that.
That was going to be the one big idea.
Well, we can certainly talk about that in more detail, too.
No, that'll be another time.
What else would you recommend to the Biden administration?
Well, you know, one of the things that really made me feel very good about working as a volunteer for the campaign was on the Zoom calls we had, the large number of young people, people of color, and particularly women of color. And the one thing that I would say, and I do believe based on the statements of Secretary Blinken and the president when he went to the State Department, is that diversity has to improve within the Department of State. We as diplomats are the face of our country. And the Department of State, sadly, has failed for years. I mean, the problem with diversity goes back to 1924, a passage of the Rogers Act, which professionalized diplomacy. And one of the first recommendations that came out of a personnel committee to the Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes, who later became Supreme Court Justice, was, it doesn't matter how well African-American men or women, and these were white women, do on the competitive test, they should not be brought into the Foreign Service. And Charles Evans Hughes, to his great credit, said, no, I'm not going to do that. But, you know, the State Department is viewed as elitist. It's still viewed as dominated by white men. And there is so much energy and innovation in our country. We need to do a better job of bringing in diverse people, particularly people from minorities. This is the subject of another talk, of course, but I feel very strongly about it. And I have been happy to see some of the people on those calls now in the federal government. and I respect them. I respect their energy, their perspective, you know, what they bring. So that would be my one recommendation.
Well, Ambassador Marcus Asquino, thank you so much for your time and
Great
for your
fun.
many great insights on this topic, you know, of China's role in
It's a
Africa.
fascinating talk and a topic, and I enjoyed reading the article. I don't agree with everything, but I got a lot out of it. I thought it was a great way to have one of these sessions on that topic.
Yeah, I agree. And boy, the articles have improved since their production under the Trump administration. Where
Oh my God. Yeah. And I'm waiting to see some of the people who will go out as ambassadorial nominations as well. We can do better on that. So we'll see.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for your time. And folks, of course, we'd love to see you tomorrow for our first Russia disruption series. It's going to be a good one. And we've got some pretty big names to announce on that. And love to see you then. And until then, have a great day, everybody. And we'll see you tomorrow.